Welcome to another episode of this R80 RT conversion project from Boxer 2 Valve. And last time we removed the fairing and we got as far as this. We got down to the fork tubes. We got the fork sliders off, the wheel off, the brakes off. And the next thing we want to do is have a look at these fork tubes, remove them, inspect them, and then also we're going to remove these handlebars and change out the steering head bearings because these are severely notched. They have a very, very pronounced center position right there. You can actually see it snap into place. That's how worn these things are, but we're going to change them. Okay, so the first things first is probably the easiest thing to do is to remove the handlebars. Just going to kind of go ahead and get all these cables and things sort of out of the way. Just leave the combi switches like that. Make sure you don't lose the screw, but if you're careful, you can just leave it in there. Just be cautious about that. Now the brake light and clutch switches, I'm actually just going to go ahead and disconnect those. They're really easy plugs to access here under the tank. And it's easy enough to remember how they go back together again because the clutch switch is two brown wires that are connected. Basically, it's a ground circuit being completed. And the other is the green connected to the yellow on this bike. So just kind of note how it comes apart on your bike in case there's any discrepancy there. And it's just nice to get this stuff kind of out of the way because we're going to have to reroute everything from scratch later on. Okay, at this point, we're going to go ahead and lower the bike back down again. As we're going to be replacing the upper choke cable as well as the throttle cables and the clutch cable because we're going to be putting lower bars on. So I'm just going to go ahead and get those off here and out of the way. Starting with the choke cable. You sort of unhook that like that. Fits in there like so. Fits in like so. Not much grease in there, something that has to be greased up. We'll do that when we put it back together again. To remove the throttle cables, just take the screw out, pull the cables out. This chain cam can be removed and the cables come out like so. I'm just going to go ahead and lay this all right back inside there so it stays together. Once we put it back together again, we're going to clean this thoroughly, grease everything. They look to be in pretty decent shape. Felt pretty good too. So I think we got a part that could be reused, but definitely needs a little bit of maintenance. But for right now, just going to pop this right back in place and keep everything together. But first remove the throttle sleeve. That can come off right now. Set that aside. Now I'm going to remove the upper brake hose and take the right control unit off. So we won't be using this upper brake hose, that's for sure, so might as well just get rid of that. And then by loosening this bolt here with a 4mm Allen wrench, that control assembly comes off as easy as that. So we'll set that aside for later use. In order to finally remove this left-hand assembly, I want to disconnect and remove the clutch cable. The easy way to do that is with a kind of a big screwdriver like that. You can lay that right in here on the foot peg bracket and press against the lever, and then you can pop the cable out and release the lever. Okay, I'm now going to cut these zip ties off. Go ahead and remove the cable completely because we're going to be changing it. Sort of note how it's routed. It goes up the right tube of the frame through this gusset and goes across. That's pretty much the correct routing. Now just compress the lever and then this barrel end comes out. Make sure you don't lose that barrel. So, and then you can remove the cable. Put the barrel in a safe spot because you're going to need it when you reassemble. So this is a non-heated grip model, which means that the left grip is glued onto the handlebar. So of course the easiest way is just slice it off and get a new one. But if the grip's in good shape like this and you want to try to save a couple bucks, one way to actually remove them is to get a skinny screwdriver like this and try to kind of wedge that in, and then take something like WD-40 and put the straw in there. Just get some of that to go inside. Depending on how it was applied, that might loosen things up. You can see how it's starting to. There we go. Maybe go in a little deeper now. Give it one more little spritz. There we go, removed without any damage. You just want to clean that out really well with some brake cleaner or something like that that doesn't leave a residue. And then it's ready to reinstall. Okay, same deal over here, 4mm Allen. And the left control slides off. Save it for later. Okay, so we're really getting down to basics here. Next thing I want to do is remove these clamps. Now you see this top part here. That's that part that's just needed for holding on that dash pad. They're basically bolts that are welded onto this plate. Just need to remove the nuts down below. There's usually a wave washer and a nut, and then there's these little special washers here that go around there. So take that off too, because they invariably will fall down and roll away. There we go, it's getting loose now. Okay, now with those fasteners removed, we can just simply remove everything in one piece like that. You may or may not be using these parts again, depending on what dash pad you want to use, or if you want to use one at all. And in which case you could put Allen bolts in or hex bolts. And also keep in mind too that the bolt pattern on this upper plate here, upper triple clamp, whatever you want to call it, is the same as it's been since day one. So if you wanted to put some cool old like /5/6 or even the cool R90S clamps on there for your handlebars, that's totally optional. You just got to source those someplace. It's probably a pretty good idea actually. Okay, so might be needing these, we may not, but we'll save them no matter what and set these aside. Okay, the next thing I want to do is take these top plugs out, and that'll also allow me to remove the fork springs. But first, I'm just going to loosen this one. Now, these are all 36mm, so either you need a big 36mm wrench or a 36mm socket. Those weren't too tight. And then while you're at it, just at least loosen this middle one, because once you remove these, you won't have the same integrity anymore to rely on the steering stop to loosen it. So these are usually pretty tight. Oh, hui. It was pretty tight. I guess I didn't have my Wheaties this morning, but we have a fork tube that can make it a lot easier to loosen that. There we go. So just simply remove the cap. These are pretty buggered from previous attempts at tightening without the proper tools, so these are going to go on the list of things to replace. Same goes here. So these, I believe, are the stock fork springs. And they're a little soft. We've got some pretty cool replacements that we're going to be using when we put it all back together again. But we'll hang on to these for right now. We'll probably be putting some different ones back in when assembly time comes. And now the upper triple clamp is removed. And this will all need to be cleaned up before it goes back and installed. When we put everything back together, it'll be clean. But I'm just going to set this all aside right now and keep moving along. Now, the fork tubes, they show really quite a bit of wear. I can see this ridge down here where there's a fair amount of wear. Also in here, this sort of shiny spot here. There's what looked like maybe a couple of pits from, stones over the years. But there's no rust, and they're actually probably technically serviceable. So if you didn't want to spend the money on a new set of fork tubes, and you had a set of fork tubes like this, you'd probably would be okay. Before we make that determination, for sure, however, we want to put them on a V-block and check them for run out. But making the assumption right now, just from a visual inspection, the assumption is that we're going to probably reuse them, or you could reuse them. Actually, we probably won't. We'll probably put new ones on, to be perfectly honest with you. But you could. So having said that, you want to definitely mark the tubes before you take them off. Just in case you do decide to reuse them, you want them to go in on the same side they came off, in the exact same position that they came off. A very good way to do that is with a permanent marker. And right on the split, right in the middle, make a mark. So you can use that as a reference to get it in the same position. And then I just going to change this into an L so I know it's the left-hand side. And then the same thing here. Remove the bolt, and sometimes it's a pretty tight fit and the fork tube won't quite just come out on its own, but it doesn't take much to get that out of there. So a relatively large screwdriver sort of placed in there like so, and then I'm going to just grab it because it's going to want to come out by itself. Just tap that in a little bit just to spread it ever so slightly, and then the fork tube comes out. It doesn't take much. So it's the exact same story here. Really doesn't take much at all. It comes right out. Okay, now we're right down to the lower triple clamp, and the notchiness we've been feeling all along is like definitely not any better. So we're going to take this nut off and that off too. Okay, so now we could just tap the steering stem through the bearing, and sometimes it's a pretty tight fit. So what works well if you have it is like a brass hammer. It won't really mar that, or even better yet, a plastic one. But I'm just going to start to get this thing loose. A couple wraps, you can feel it go. There it goes, and then I'll just follow up with this plastic one, just like that, which comes out. So there you have it, and here is the upper bearing. Now, there's a lot of wear on here. You can see it. I can also feel, however, that the grease is really like thick, and it's not allowing this bearing to turn. So it's a combination of worn out bearings and dried up grease. But in any case, definitely has to be done. Now, if you've watched our previous video series about the R90/6, we also did steering head bearings here. It's unavoidable that some of this stuff's going to be the same information, but maybe you learn something from it from a different angle or whatever. But we're going to go ahead and replace the steering head bearings on this video. Okay, so now having that apart, we'll be moving on to that in a bit. Let's get these outer races out first. Okay, for removing the steering head bearings, among other bearings on this motorcycle, the Kuko puller is definitely a cool tool to have. Basically, this bridge is going to exert pressure on the outer part of the steering head, and this expandable tool is going to extract the inner bearing without doing any damage to anything. These are available in different sizes and for different bearings. This is the 21-6 extractor for steering head bearings. So you set that right in there and see how that expands, and then tighten this nut. And you can just feel how it goes underneath that bearing, just catches the very bottom lip of it. Then you'll need a 22mm wrench to tighten this nut. You don't need to go too crazy, just put a little tension on there. And then we'll bring this all down. Okay, you carefully line up the pads on this tool so that you can still see that the bearing will pass through it. You're trying to get as much of a bite on the steering head on the frame as you can. And now you'll need a 32mm wrench or the equivalent, or a big adjustable spanner, whatever works for you, to simply tighten this nut and watch as the bearing race extracts. Just as easy as that. And now we'll quite simply repeat that on the other side. So you can see how it's just about to come out all the way. Just a little bit more. Support the tool, because once it does come loose, the tool will fall. And that was that. Okay, now that the outer races have been extracted out of the frame, we need to remove the inner bearing race from the steering stem. And there's several different ways you can do it. You could push the stem through on a press. That'll release the bearing. And then push the stem back in again. That's one way to do it. This is the best way the way I do it, and I'm just going to show you the way I do it, but there's probably other ways that can be done too. But this is fairly simple. So first step is to basically, since the bearing's trash anyway, we're going to just destroy the cage, and you can just cut this sheet metal like that, and then sort of pry that away. And just any way you can, where you can get at that sheet metal part, just cut it. Okay, and now you can start taking the bearing rollers out. And a slick way to do that is with a magnet, because it's just a nice way to get those things out of there. Kind of pry that up. You cut the bottom of the cage. And now this can just simply be removed entirely. Get all the bearings out of there. Okay, the trick now is to get this bearing on. It's a press fit there. And if you had the right kind of puller, a long puller, you could probably, hook into this edge and pull that off. So another way is I'm going to make a little slice in here with a Dremel, with a cutoff wheel, and then crack it, and it comes off pretty easy that way. So I got my glasses on. Okay, so I've made a slice in there, pretty much just about the thickness of the bearing, and hopefully now with a chisel I can just crack it the rest of the way. So I've got a fairly sharp chisel here, set that right in that crack. Oh yeah, cracked. Cool. So they cracked all the way through. So you can kind of feel when the bearing's cracked, because you get this kind of rubbery feeling. But I'm just going to take a small screwdriver now into that crack and spread it a little bit. And you can see just by spreading that a little bit that bearing race is opened up enough to where it's no longer a press fit and it'll come off. So this is, once in a while you run into this also, is that this, because of the steering stop, a little raised area there, so easy enough to fix that, but that's sort of holding me up now. Just going to chuck that in the vise and then just hit that with a file to get that raised edge off that's kind of smushed on there because of the steering lock caused that to happen. There we go. So that comes off easily with that cracked bearing. So I always try not to damage this thing, but I don't know if I did it or if it was from before. It's a little bit bent. This is the lower bearing sort of grease retainer thing. I'm gonna go ahead and put a new one of those on. So I went ahead and cleaned the lower triple clamp. There's a lot of dried grease on there. And I've got a new one of these cups I'm gonna set on there. And some new steering head bearings. We offer these as a set. We have a couple different types. This is the Mark and Swiss version. This is like we could consider OEM replacement, and they're really high quality. All the ones we sell are, of course. So we're going to just take these out of the package, like so. Lay that on there. See, they're really nicely wrapped. The outer race with also a piece of paper, so they're supplied in really great condition, great packaging. All right, nice fresh new bearings. Okay, these bearings are packaged in grease so they don't rust in storage and so on, but I want to go ahead and clean that off and then introduce some fresh grease onto the bearings. So to do that, first thing I'll do is grab some gloves. Some eye protection. And then I'll take some brake parts cleaner, works really well, and just going to basically spray a little bit on the bearing. Doesn't need much. You just want to remove that grease and then blow that off. And then on the outer bearings, just gonna wipe them out with the same cleaning solution. So you can see that grease that just came off of there. All right. Now the old bearings, when they came out, like we looked at before, they're like super stiff. They don't even really turn anymore. They're just like sludge. In comparison here, they spin nice and smoothly. And that's because this grease is dried up, and it might have been wheel bearing grease, but just like it's just old. These bikes are old, and the grease gets dry. Now the best thing you can use to combat that is we found this LM47 grease from Liqui-Moly, because it's specially designed not to harden. It keeps its kind of fluid state for many, many years, and it works very well. It's giving good steering action. This is in a tube, 400-gram tube. It also comes in these little tubes. One of these is really enough for quite a lot of things. You do steering head bearings. We have a bearing packer. We do enough of these, and easy way to pack these bearings with a bearing packer like this is pretty slick if you have one. You set them in there and just push down. You can kind of see how the grease has pushed its way through. I'll show you. See, look at that. I just pushed grease in from the bottom, and you can see how that pushed all the way through. So you know that all the cavities on the inside are full. So I can take this excess here and wipe that around the outside, and now I've got a really nicely greased bearing without any excess. It's just inside and out, it's greased, ready to install. I'll just drop it in the race there, you're good to go. Now you might not have a bearing packer, so I'll show you another way to do it if you don't, by hand, the old-fashioned way. And that's coming right up. So you'll want to have a pair of gloves on like this, and then take your grease, good amount of it, and place that in the palm of your hand, like so. And then take the clean bearing and just go from the wide side, push, and you'll see pretty soon how the grease will come through the top. And just keep working at it like this until you see the grease coming through all the way around. So you're basically doing the exact same thing that we did on the bearing packer once you get it all done. There we go. So I've worked all the way around there and saw how the grease kind of popped out all around the top, and now we'll smear a little bit around the outside again here. And now this bearing is also greased just as well as the other one. Just took a little bit more time than with the packer, but the results are identical. So now with this new grease cap installed, the grease cup installed, I should say, I put the bearing on with the taper, narrow taper up. So when you put the new bearing on there, you'll meet resistance right away because that's where the upper bearing sits. And to get past that, you need to just tap it past a little ways. So that you don't damage the bearing, you can use that old inner bearing race that we split a few minutes ago and put that on upside down, and that'll just make contact with the inner race there. And then you'll be able to tap on that. I put a socket on there, and that gets past that point. You can continue to use the split old bearing race that we took off earlier to drive that down by taking a chisel or a punch and kind of working around to make sure that the bearing goes down and seats evenly. Another way to do it is to fashion a tool like this. And this is a really clean way to do it. This is basically nothing other than a piece of old fork tube. You can use any kind of tubing that has the right inside opening so that it fits over the top. You'll notice how we cut a little bit of a chamfer on there on the lathe and put a cap on the other end. So it's a pretty cool little tool to have. And you see how that just slips right over the top, and it makes a perfect surface contact with the bearing. And the fact that it's tapered is it's just on the inside race. So I'm going to bring that over here onto the anvil part of the vise and set that down. And now I can drive that bearing in nice and cleanly. That's the sound we're looking for. Cool. So that one is now ready to install. Moving back over to the motorcycle now. Okay, first thing to do now is clean out very thoroughly the frame. Get all the old grease out of there. Take your time and make sure it's all removed. All right, it's looking good. This is just a standard bearing driver. You can get any kind of discount tool supply place. It works great for getting these bearings back in. So you just kind of want to line that up like so, and then kind of eyeball it to make sure it's going straight, and drive the bearing in partially like that. There we go. Okay, so now you could drive it all the way in. It's certainly one way to do it. I prefer to draw them together, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Basically take the bearing driver like that on one end, and another one, you need two of this, on the other end. And then I've just got a piece of threaded rod here that goes right through the whole thing. A couple of 19mm wrenches, and then pulls the bearings in and seats them without a lot of banging. I like that better. So that's a pretty cool tool, simple, inexpensive, and effective. Okay, in preparation for the assembly, I'm just going to kind of get some tools laid out. Need a hammer, and that split bearing again, sort of prepared, and the new bearing. So slide that up in there all the way, lay that bearing in there, put that race in upside down like so, and now I can just like tap that just so it's on enough now to where it's not going to fall out. The rest of it I can do with a kind of a pointed drift to get in there tight, and just going to kind of like push that up with my knee. So there you go. Then this chrome cap goes back on, polished up real nice, and the steering head bearing adjustment nut has a sort of a flat side and a tapered side. The tapered side goes down. And then you'll want to tighten this down. This is a hook wrench that came with the toolkit, if you got one with your toolkit. Otherwise, it is an available tool to purchase. And just snug that down for right now. So there's the steering head bearings are installed in a very preliminary fashion. So we already established that the brakes are going to get changed out. I'm going to put new rotors on, and I will definitely put new tires on too. The profile is still good on the tires. These are nice Pirellis, they're pretty decent, but the date on here, 2815, that means this tire was made in the 28th week of 2015. And since we're about the same time in 2019, the tire's about 4 years old, and I'd feel better about having a little bit fresher rubber on there, just because. And at the very minimum, the wheels need to be cleaned, maybe painted. We'll see how far we go with that, but for sure, before any of this happens, the bearings are going to come out because we're going to clean them and we'll put new bearings in later. So for right now, just going to show how to remove the bearings. Reinstalling them will come in a future video. So here again, the Kuko puller is the way to go because there's no real way to get in and knock the bearing out from the inside. They're sealed bearings. On some bikes, the spacer sleeve shifts a little bit and you can just sneak a punch in there and grab it from the back side. It's pretty tough to do on these. It might be worth a try, but the Kuko puller works great. So for this one, you need the 21-4 puller and this little adapter if you're using this bridge that we have. And just like the steering head bearings, but different. So we just let that tool go inside and then expand the puller part. Now with a 17mm wrench, we can expand that and make sure that it's just grabbing right on that edge of that bearing. Okay, so as we lower this bridge onto there, it's going to exert pressure onto the brake rotor or the wheel hub, depending on where we line it up. And both of these are made out of aluminum, and the puller is steel with some little serrations on the bottom. So to protect that from marring, just simply a couple of washers, anything that you might have laying around will be sufficient. And that'll be a nice little pad for the tool to push on. We won't leave any marks. So I'm just lowering the legs down onto these washers. There we go. And with our 32mm wrench, we'll be able to easily extract the wheel bearing. There we go. So that extracted the bearing with no damage to the wheel or brake. So you can see that these are sealed bearings. They are pre-greased from the factory. There's really no adjustment needs to be done. Just put the new ones in later on. But you see, I see there's a lot of rust, and also inside too, visibly. So we'll clean that up real nice. And so this is machined to be the exact right thickness for this wheel. And when everything's all put together, the shimming is correct. You don't need to do any messing around with that. Okay, now we're going to pull the bearing out of the other side. So I'm going to set those washers down again and relax the tool for one more time here. And there's that one. Okay, so the bearings are out. And next thing I'll do is remove the brake discs. Nothing really to show there, just basically a couple of wrenches and take the nuts off. The brake discs will come off, then we'll get the wheel either cleaned up or painted. And then we'll put the bearings in later on and put a new tire on, all the good stuff. Yeah, so I took the discs off and looking at the wheel, and it's a nice wheel. It's in great shape. I think though that this bike is going to look pretty cool if we have the wheels powder coated. That's the final decision we made here. So since I'm sending the front wheel out to have it powder coated, I want to take the rear wheel off too. We're going to do the final drive repairs later, but I'm just going to take the rear wheel off so that we can have it powder coated at the same time. It just makes sense. And so the bike's going to have to sit here with no wheels on it and no forks on it for a week or so while this is all happening. So I'm going to try to figure out a cool way to support the bike safely so that we can kind of work around it. So the first thing I'm going to do, it's always a good idea when you do weird stuff on a bike like this, on any of them, is put a strap between the center stand and, for example, here the crossover pipe is a perfect thing since it's still on there. And by doing that, you're pretty much guaranteeing that the center stand won't collapse. And then you can do some pretty crazy things moving it around without any danger. So that keeps the center stand pulled forward so it can't retract. And I'm going to pull the bike forward a bit and then loosen the wheel bolts. Now, if you have a helper who can help you hold the brake down, that's the best way to do it. My helper's holding the camera, so I usually do something different. And I'm just going to take a strap and run it onto the brake pedal and onto my lift here. Now the brake's on, and I can remove the rear wheel bolts without any problem. Just need them loose for right now, and I'll take the strap back off again. Okay, so now I'm going to find a way to do this. I got this jack stand here that I think I can just put up underneath the exhaust. There, that should hold that. And maybe one on the other side. Yeah, that'll work. And now I can take that rear wheel off. Now, this is pretty typical. When you go to take the rear wheel off, it doesn't seem like it wants to come off. That's because the brake has some wear on it and has probably a little lip worn into the rear drum, and so simply have to loosen the rear brake adjustment by several turns. There we go. See, I mean, you do some pretty crazy stuff when you got the center stand strapped down. Whatever it takes. There we go. I'm going to put a few straps on here now to kind of hold it in place. Have a look at this rear wheel. So yeah, it does have quite a lot of wear on here. Quite a lot of wear on the edge. That's why it was so hard to take off. So I think we may be able to clean that up a little bit, but we'll have to have a look and see what we could do. Or maybe find another wheel. I'll look into it. But in the meantime, it's good to get these little side projects kind of rolling so we're not waiting for anything as we try to move forward with the project here. So I think a strap or two will keep it secured here on the jack stands until we can get back to work again on it. Okay, so that's just about as sturdy as it can be, just as sturdy as if it had two wheels on it. And so this is the way the bike's gonna be waiting for us until we get back into the filming mode. In the meantime, we'll have the forks recoated, the fork sliders recoated, we'll have the wheels recoated, we'll see what we do with this rear wheel, and new tires and all that good stuff, and we'll start putting it all back together as we then have a solid chassis to work with and move into the engine and all the other good stuff on this bike. So that's it for right now. There's not a whole lot more I can do until I get the parts in. And this is William from Bach 2 Valve saying thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and you'll see lots of videos as we progress with this really awesome project here. And leave your comments. Let us know what you think. If you have any questions, put them on here in the video link or send us an email. And we really appreciate your enthusiasm and look forward to the next episode. Keep the shiny side up.